The date is November the 24th, 1971. It is the night before Thanksgiving, and Northwest Orient Flight 305 is exactly the kind of flight nobody remembers. A short hop, Portland to Seattle. 42 minutes of routine sky. The passengers are ordinary people, salesmen, families, tired commuters folding their coats into the overhead bins. The crew is professional, unhurried, going through motions they have performed 100 times before. Outside the small oval windows, the Pacific Northwest is already dark, already cold, already indifferent. Row 18. A man sits alone. He is not young, not old. Somewhere in his 40s, most people will later guess. Dark sunglasses, a black clip-on tie, a brown sport coat that nobody will be able to precisely describe afterward, because there is nothing about him that invites a second look. He orders a bourbon. He lights a cigarette. He does not make conversation. He does not fidget. He simply sits there, in row 18, with the particular stillness of a man who has already decided what he is going to do and has made his peace with it. Sometime after takeoff, he reaches into his briefcase and he writes a note. He hands it to a flight attendant named Florence Schaffner. She assumes it is a phone number. Men hand notes to flight attendants sometimes. She slips it, unread, into her pocket. He leans forward. His voice is measured, almost polite. "Miss, you'd better look at that note." She opens it. It says he has a bomb. In the next 4 hours, this man, who checked in under the name Dan Cooper, who a garbled wire report would accidentally rename DB Cooper, and who the FBI would spend the next 5 decades trying to identify, will negotiate $200,000 in unmarked bills, demand 4 parachutes, release all but 1 crew member, and somewhere over the black wilderness of the Cascade Mountains, lower the aft staircase of a Boeing 727, step into a wall of freezing rain moving at 150 miles per hour, and disappear. No body was ever recovered, no parachute ever found, no credible confirmed sighting, no deathbed confession that held up, no grave, no trail. Just the ghost shape of a man who sat in row 18, finished his bourbon, and walked out the back of a moving plane into a storm. The FBI called it NORJAC, Northwest Hijacking. It is the only unsolved case of air piracy in the entire history of American commercial aviation, and it begins here, on a Tuesday night, with a folded note and the sound of ice shifting in a plastic cup. Who was this man? And how does someone vanish into thin air with $200,000 and the entire FBI behind them? It starts, as most extraordinary things do, with something completely ordinary. At approximately 2:50 in the afternoon on November the 24th, 1971, a man walks up to the Northwest Orient ticket counter at Portland International Airport and purchases a one-way fare to Seattle. He pays cash. The ticket costs $18.52. He gives his name as Dan Cooper. No middle name, no elaboration, no hesitation. The agent behind the counter processes the transaction without a second glance. There is nothing to flag. There is nothing to remember. In 1971, you could buy a plane ticket the way you bought a bus ticket. No ID required, no security screening, no body scanner, no bag x-ray, no federal watch list cross-reference. You handed over your money, you got your boarding pass, and you walked to your gate. He carries a briefcase and a brown paper bag. He is dressed neatly, a black clip-on tie, a white dress shirt, a dark suit jacket, dark pressed pants. Witnesses will later describe him as clean-shaven, olive-complexioned, approximately 5'10", and somewhere between 40 and 50 years old. He wears dark sunglasses despite the overcast afternoon. Nobody finds this strange. He finds a seat in the boarding area and he waits. Flight 305 departs Portland at 2:58 p.m. There are 36 passengers aboard, along with a crew of 6. Captain William Scott is at the controls. The flight time to Seattle-Tacoma is scheduled at approximately 30 minutes. It is, by every metric available to everyone on that plane, a completely unremarkable Tuesday afternoon in November. The man in row 18 orders a bourbon and soda shortly after takeoff. He pays for it, reportedly with a $20 bill, and tells the flight attendant to keep the change. This detail matters later, not for what it proves, but for what it suggests. A man who is either naturally courteous or performing courtesy with deliberate precision. A man who does not want to be remembered as rude. A man, some investigators would later note, who seems to understand that the crew are not his enemies. They are his leverage, and he intends to treat them accordingly. It is Florence Schaffner, the flight attendant working the rear cabin, who receives the note first. As described in her own account, she initially assumes it is a pass, the kind of note a travelling salesman might slip to an attractive woman in a uniform. She pockets it without reading it. He waits a beat, then leans in with a quiet correction. "Miss, you'd better look at that." The note, in block printing, states that he has a bomb in his briefcase and that she's to sit down beside him. She does. He opens the briefcase just enough to show her its interior. A tangle of wires, red cylinders, and what appears to be a battery. Whether it is a real explosive device or an elaborate prop has never been conclusively determined. It does not matter. Florence Schaffner believes it, and that is sufficient. He gives her his demands, $200,000 in negotiable, unmarked $20 bills. 4 parachutes, 2 primary, 2 reserve. A fuel truck standing by at Seattle-Tacoma to refuel the aircraft on arrival. And no interference from law enforcement, or he will detonate the device. His tone throughout, Schaffner and the other crew members will later report, is calm, almost businesslike. He is not sweating, he is not scanning the cabin, he does not raise his voice once across the entire 4-hour ordeal. He orders another bourbon at some point, nurses it, and waits. Schaffner relays the demands to Captain Scott, who radios Seattle Approach Control, who immediately contacts Northwest Orient headquarters and the FBI. A decision is made at the highest available level: comply. The FBI and airline officials scramble. Banks are contacted. $200,000 is assembled. 10,000 unmarked $20 bills that, crucially, the FBI photographs every single serial number of before delivery. The parachutes are sourced through a local skydiving school. Everything is ready and waiting on the tarmac at Seattle-Tacoma when Flight 305 touches down at 5:39 p.m. The plane taxis to a remote area of the airfield and holds. The passengers are told there is a mechanical issue. For the next hour, the 36 passengers sit in unknowing proximity to a man with an alleged bomb, while outside, under floodlights, FBI agents and airline executives debate the terms of a handover. At 5:45, a Northwest Orient employee named Al Lee drives a car out to the plane and delivers a white cloth bag containing the money and the parachutes via the aft staircase. He hands them up to Cooper directly. Cooper inspects the bag. He counts, or appears to count. He seems satisfied. He then does something that, in hindsight, tells us something profound about his character, or his confidence, perhaps both. He releases all 36 passengers, every single one. He keeps only the cockpit crew and 2 flight attendants, one of whom, Tina Mucklow, he will keep close for the remainder of the flight. He does not harm anyone. He does not threaten anyone beyond the original declaration. He simply says the passengers are free to go, and they go, filing off the plane in confusion and relief into the dark Seattle evening, most of them still unaware of what had actually been happening 30 feet above their heads. His next set of demands, the plane is to fly to Mexico City. Altitude below 10,000 feet. Airspeed as slow as the aircraft can safely maintain. He specifies below 150 knots. Landing gear down. Flaps at 15 degrees, a configuration that makes the Boeing 727 burn fuel at an extraordinary rate and flies it at barely above stall speed. Captain Scott tells him the plane cannot make Mexico City on 1 tank in those conditions. Cooper allows a fuel stop. Reno, Nevada. They take off from Seattle at 7:40 p.m. The remaining crew is in the cockpit with the door closed, per Cooper's instructions. Tina Mucklow stays in the rear cabin with him for a time, and her account of those hours is among the most intimate portraits anyone has of the man. He is not gloating. He is not agitated. He studies the terrain maps he has asked for. He ties the money bag to himself with what appears to be parachute cord. At some point, he tells her she should go join the others in the cockpit. He does not want her in the back when he jumps. She asks if there is anything else he needs. He says no. He seems to mean it. At approximately 8:13 p.m., a warning light illuminates in the cockpit. The aft air stair door has been activated. Captain Scott gets on the intercom and asks Cooper if there is anything they can do for him. There is no response. The plane is flying at approximately 10,000 feet, somewhere over the dense wilderness of southwestern Washington state, in rain and near-zero visibility, at an airspeed so low that the 727 is fighting its own aerodynamics to stay level. Somewhere between the towns of Ariel and Woodland, Washington, D.B. Cooper stepped off the back of a moving aircraft and fell into one of the most unforgiving landscapes in the continental United States. No one in the cockpit heard him go. When the plane landed in Reno at 10:15 p.m. and FBI agents rushed aboard, they found the rear cabin empty. 2 parachutes unused, the necktie still on the seat, a few of the negotiation notes, some cigarette butts, 8 partial fingerprints on a drinking glass, and a paper cup. And outside, over a 25-mile swath of old-growth forest and volcanic river valley in a Pacific Northwest rainstorm, somewhere between 10,000 feet and the ground, nothing. No signal, no sound, no trace. He was simply gone. By the time Flight 305 touched down in Reno and the FBI agents rushed aboard to find an empty rear cabin, the machinery of the largest air piracy investigation in American history was already in motion. Within hours of the Seattle handover, the Bureau had activated field offices across the Pacific Northwest. Military units were placed on standby. The Washington State Patrol and local county sheriffs were briefed. Search and rescue teams were assembled and waiting for first light. The FBI named the case NORJAC, Northwest Hijacking, and assigned it a priority status that would not be downgraded for decades. What they were walking into, though none of them fully understood it yet, was not a manhunt, it was a maze. The first problem was geography. Cooper's jump zone, the area of southwestern Washington state over which the aircraft was flying when that aft staircase light illuminated, was not a meadow. It was not farmland. It was not the kind of open, searchable terrain that law enforcement requires to conduct a ground search with any realistic hope of finding a person. It was, and remains, some of the most hostile wilderness in the lower 48 states. Dense Douglas fir forest, river gorges, volcanic ridgelines, elevation changes of several thousand feet within a few lateral miles. In November, the undergrowth is thick and rain-soaked and dark, even at midday. At night, in the storm conditions that prevailed on November 24, 1971, it was effectively impenetrable. A man could be 50 yards from a search team and never be found. A body could lie in that forest for years without being disturbed by anything except the weather and the animals. The army deployed more than 200 soldiers in the initial ground search. They walked grids through the forest for days. They found nothing. No parachute canopy caught in the trees. No impact site. No cache. No footprints. No clothing. No sign whatsoever that any human being had descended from the sky into those woods on the night of November 24th. Which brings us to the first thread that does not hold. If D.B. Cooper was an experienced parachutist, and the operational confidence he displayed throughout the hijacking strongly suggests he was, then he made a choice during the ransom handover at Seattle-Tacoma that no experienced parachutist would make. Among the 4 parachutes delivered to the aircraft, 2 were civilian sport rigs with steerable canopies. Modern, maneuverable, designed for precision landings. The other 2 were military surplus rigs, older, non-steerable, round canopies that give the jumper almost no ability to control where they land. In the pitch darkness, in a rainstorm, over forested mountain terrain, the ability to steer your canopy is not a luxury. It is the difference between surviving and not. Cooper took one of the military surplus rigs. He left the steerable civilian parachutes on the plane. FBI investigators noticed this almost immediately, and it has never been satisfactorily explained. Some agents argued it proved Cooper was not a trained skydiver at all, that he chose randomly, or grabbed the nearest rig, or simply did not know the difference. But this sits uneasily alongside everything else we know about how he behaved. This was a man who specified the aircraft's altitude, airspeed, and flap configuration with the precision of someone who understood aeronautics. A man who chose his jump window with enough awareness to wait until the plane was over a specific terrain corridor. A man who brought his own cord to tie the money bag to his body. It is very difficult to construct a version of D.B. Cooper who is simultaneously aeronautically sophisticated and parachute ignorant, unless the parachute choice was not a mistake. One theory that FBI investigators quietly circulated in the early years of NORJAC was that Cooper may have taken the military surplus rig deliberately because he knew it was packed and certified and reliable, whereas a civilian sport rig sourced urgently from a skydiving school in the middle of a hijacking negotiation might not have been. There is a darker variation of this theory, that one of the civilian parachutes delivered to the plane was, in fact, a training dummy rig. A non-functional chute used for instruction purposes, packed to look real, but incapable of deployment. If Cooper had any intelligence about what was coming onto that plane, he may have known to avoid it. The FBI has never officially confirmed whether a dummy chute was among the 4 delivered. Different agents have given different answers across different decades. The record on this specific question is frustratingly inconsistent. Then there is the question of the weather. The conditions at jump altitude on the night of November 24, 1971, were not merely unpleasant. They were, by any reasonable assessment, survivable only under a very specific and narrow set of circumstances. The outside air temperature at 10,000 feet was near freezing. The aircraft was moving at somewhere between 150 and 170 miles per hour when the staircase was activated, meaning that Cooper, upon exiting, would have been immediately hit by a wall of wind far beyond what any normal jump produces. He was wearing a business suit, a light jacket, and loafers. No helmet, no jumpsuit, no thermal layer, no goggles. He was carrying a heavy bag of cash tied to his body. He was jumping blind at night, into terrain he could not see, in rain he could not see through, at a speed and altitude that gave him approximately 2 to 4 minutes of free fall and canopy time before he hit whatever was below him. The FBI's own aeronautical experts, when they modelled the jump in the weeks after the hijacking, were candid. The probability of survival under those conditions without prior military or special operations parachute training was extremely low. The probability of survival under those conditions with prior training, with the specific experience of conducting night jumps in adverse weather over forest terrain, was significantly higher, but still far from certain. What the Bureau could not explain was why, if Cooper did survive and walk out of those woods, there was no record of him ever spending the money. All 10,000 serial numbers had been photographed. Every bank in the Pacific Northwest was alerted. The FBI distributed a reference list to financial institutions, car dealerships, anyone who handled large volumes of cash. Months passed, then a year, then 5 years. The bills, every single one of them, remained undetected in circulation. Not a single serial number was flagged, not one. This is not how most criminals behave after a successful score. Most people, under the pressure of a significant cash windfall, spend something, a car, a debt paid off, a down payment. Something enters the economy and leaves a trace. 10 years after the hijacking, not a dollar of Cooper's money had surfaced in any traceable way. The FBI received more than 1,000 suspect names in the first year alone. Tips came in from across the country, ex-military men who had gone quiet, neighbours who had disappeared around that time, brothers and uncles and co-workers who had always seemed a little too calm about things. Agents followed up on hundreds of these leads with full investigations. They conducted polygraph examinations, they traced financial records, they interviewed families and employers and former colleagues. One by one, the suspects were cleared, or the evidence was insufficient, or the trail simply went cold. The case that had seemed, in those first electrified hours after Reno, like it would crack within days. How far could a man with a bag of photographed money really get? Settled instead into something stranger and more durable. A mystery that could not be solved by more agents or more tips or more ground searches, because the man at the center of it had either died in a forest that swallowed him completely, or had vanished into ordinary American life with a discipline and patience that the Bureau had not fully anticipated. By the mid-1970s, Norjack had become something else. It had become folklore. And the FBI was no closer to answering the only question that had ever mattered. Who exactly had been sitting in row 18? 9 years passed. 9 years of dead ends, cleared suspects, filed reports, and a case that had quietly become the FBI's most embarrassing open wound. Not because of its scale, but because of its simplicity. One man, one plane, one bag of money, and absolutely nothing to show for nearly a decade of investigation by the most powerful law enforcement agency in the world. Then, on a February morning in 1980, an 8-year-old boy named Brian Ingram was on a family camping trip along the north bank of the Columbia River near a place called Tina Bar, a sandy, partially wooded recreational area about 12 miles downstream from Vancouver, Washington. He was doing what 8-year-olds do on riverbanks: digging. He pulled back a layer of compacted sand and found something unexpected: 3 bundles of decaying paper, held together with rubber bands that had long since begun to disintegrate. The paper itself blackened and soft with age, crumbling at the edges. His father recognized what they were before Brian fully did. They were $20 bills. The serial numbers were run within days. Every single one matched the photographed ransom list from Norjack. Of the $200,000 that D.B. Cooper had strapped to his body and carried off the back of a Boeing 727 on the night before Thanksgiving 1971, $5,800 of it had just been pulled from a sandbar on the Columbia River by a child with a stick. The FBI celebrated this, briefly, as a breakthrough. Here, at last, was physical evidence. The money was real, it was traceable, and it was in a specific location. That location, investigators assumed, would help them reconstruct Cooper's trajectory: where he landed, where he went, how the bills ended up in the river. It was the first hard data point the case had produced in 9 years, and the Bureau moved quickly to extract everything it could from it. What they found instead was a contradiction so profound it has never been resolved. The problem was the river itself. The Columbia at Tina Bar does not flow from the direction of Cooper's jump zone. The bills were not deposited by the current carrying them downstream from somewhere upstream in the Cascade foothills. Hydrological analysis conducted in the months after the discovery determined that the Columbia's flow patterns in that stretch of river would not have carried material from the jump zone to Tina Bar under any normal circumstances. The bills were not floating debris that washed ashore. They were buried, compacted into a specific layer of sediment in a way that suggested they had been deposited there and then covered by subsequent river activity over years. Which raises a question that the FBI never satisfactorily answered publicly. How did money that Cooper jumped with over the Cascade Mountains end up buried in a sand layer on the Columbia River 12 miles from Vancouver, in a location that does not align with any credible reconstruction of his jump trajectory? The theories multiplied. Some investigators argued the bills had been carried there by a tributary that connected the jump zone to the Columbia system, that Cooper landed near a creek, the money was lost or discarded, and years of water movement eventually deposited the bundles at Tina Bar. But the condition of the bills complicated this. Currency submerged in moving water for years tends to disperse and deteriorate in recognizable patterns. These bills were bundled, 3 distinct packets, still banded, however loosely. The rubber bands had held partially for nearly a decade. This is not consistent with years of tumbling through creek beds and river channels. This is consistent with bills that were stored somewhere, wrapped, protected, relatively stable, and then introduced to the river environment at a point closer to where they were found. Others went further. A small number of investigators and independent researchers have argued, carefully and with supporting hydrological data, that the bills may have been placed at Tina Bar deliberately, not by Cooper, but by someone else. That the $5,800 was a planted fragment, released into the Columbia system to create a false data point, to muddy the reconstruction of the jump zone and redirect the investigation. This theory has never gained mainstream acceptance, but it has also never been definitively refuted. The FBI's own analysis of the sediment layers around the bills produced inconsistent findings that were never fully published. The money was real. Where it came from and how it got there remains genuinely unknown. But the Columbia River bills, as disorienting as they were, are not the most unsettling piece of physical evidence in the D.B. Cooper case. That distinction belongs to the tie. When FBI agents processed the rear cabin of Flight 305 after it landed in Reno, they collected everything Cooper had left behind: the cigarette butts, the paper cups, the partial fingerprints, the parachute he chose not to use, and on the seat in row 18, coiled neatly as though he had removed it with some care, his black clip-on necktie. The tie went into evidence. It was catalogued, sealed, and filed. For nearly 30 years, it sat in an FBI evidence locker as a curiosity. A personal effect that told investigators almost nothing, because a clip-on tie is by design anonymous. No monogram, no dry cleaning tag, no maker's label that could be traced. It was simply a black tie, the kind sold in any department store in America in 1971. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, a retired FBI agent named Larry Carr, who had been assigned to breathe new life into the Norjack investigation, authorized a more sophisticated forensic analysis of the tie using technologies that had not existed in 1971. What the analysis returned stopped investigators cold. Embedded in the fabric of the tie, not on the surface, not from handling but woven into the fibers themselves, were particles of a rare titanium alloy. Not common titanium, not the kind of titanium that appears in consumer goods or even most industrial applications. A specific formulation containing trace elements including pure titanium, aluminum, and trace amounts of other metals in a combination that, when cross-referenced with industrial manufacturing records, pointed to one sector with unusual precision: aerospace manufacturing. More specifically, the particle profile was consistent with the kind of metallic dust and micro-debris generated in facilities that manufacture components for commercial and military aircraft. The kind of environment where workers go home at the end of a shift with particles embedded in their clothing that no amount of ordinary laundering fully removes. The kind of workplace where a man might spend years and where the trace evidence of that career would follow him, even when he dressed in his best suit and boarded a plane with a bomb. A 2001 analysis conducted by a forensic team working in cooperation with the FBI confirmed the titanium particle finding. It also noted the presence of a small number of additional rare earth elements in the tie fabric: strontium, bismuth, and traces of a pure unalloyed titanium that narrowed the manufacturing profile further. One researcher who subsequently analyzed the particle data independently concluded that the combination was consistent specifically with Boeing manufacturing operations in the Pacific Northwest during the late 1960s and early 1970s. Let that settle for a moment. The man who hijacked a Boeing 727 and demanded 4 parachutes and $200,000 and specified the aircraft's exact airspeed and flap configuration. That man was quite possibly wearing a necktie that had absorbed, over years of close proximity, the microscopic residue of Boeing aircraft manufacturing. This was not a desperate man. This was not a gambler who hatched a scheme in a bar and got lucky. This was someone who worked near planes, who understood how they were built, how they flew, what they could do and what they could not. Someone for whom the inside of an aircraft was not alien territory but familiar ground. Someone who had perhaps stood on tarmacs, walked through hangars, watched 727s roll off assembly lines, and spent years accumulating, in the fibers of his work clothes and his best clothes, and the clip-on tie he wore to the office, the invisible signature of his profession. The FBI never released the full particle analysis publicly. The findings were summarized in case documents, but never accompanied by the complete raw data. Requests by journalists and independent researchers to access the underlying forensic report have been met, across several decades, with either partial disclosures or denials on grounds of ongoing investigative sensitivity. An ongoing investigation. That was the Bureau's position on the tie evidence for years after the formal active investigation was wound down in 2016. And here is what that means: stripped of procedural language. The FBI found evidence in 1971 that a man sat in row 18 of a commercial aircraft and left behind a tie that pointed, with reasonable forensic specificity, toward the Pacific Northwest aerospace industry. They sat on the most complete forensic analysis of that tie for years, and when the case was officially closed, the only unsolved air piracy case in American commercial aviation history, the full tie evidence had still not been made public. What we know, and what we cannot yet prove, are separated by a remarkably thin line in this case. But the tie tells us something that the popular mythology of D.B. Cooper has consistently underplayed. The romanticized version of this story casts Cooper as a romantic outlaw, a nobody who pulled off the impossible through sheer audacity. The evidence suggests something more specific and more interesting than that. He was not nobody. He was someone with a career, someone with skills, someone with a workplace where metallic dust settled into his clothes and stayed there. And that workplace, the evidence increasingly suggests, built airplanes. Every great mystery eventually arrives at the same crossroads. The evidence has been laid out. The contradictions have been mapped. The official narrative has been stress-tested and found wanting in several places. And now comes the harder question. Not what happened, but who made it happen. Not the event, but the person behind it. And in the D.B. Cooper case, the question of identity is not merely academic. It is the load-bearing wall of the entire mystery, because everything, the parachute choice, the titanium particles, the money's strange reappearance, the FBI's decades of frustrated silence, only makes sense if you first understand what kind of person could have pulled this off. So let us be systematic about it. 3 theories, each with evidence, each with weaknesses, and at the end, one question that has never been answered. The first theory is the one most people instinctively reach for, because it is the most satisfying narratively. D.B. Cooper survived the jump. He landed somewhere in the forest of southwestern Washington, injured perhaps, cold certainly, but alive. He buried the money or cached it somewhere accessible. He walked out, or waited out, the initial search. And then, with the patience and discipline he had already demonstrated across 4 hours of controlled, methodical hijacking, he simply went back to being whoever he was before November 24th, 1971. He returned to a life. He did not spend the money, or spent it so slowly and carefully that no serial number ever surfaced in a traceable transaction. He grew old. He may have died in his bed. He may be alive still, though that seems unlikely given that he appeared to be in his mid-40s in 1971, which would place him well past 90 today. The evidence that supports this theory is more substantial than it first appears. Start with the money. The complete absence of any flagged serial number in the decade following the hijacking is not nothing. It is in fact a remarkable demonstration of either extraordinary restraint or extraordinary planning. Most criminals who acquire a large sum of cash cannot resist the gravitational pull of spending it. Cooper apparently could, or had a strategy for laundering it that was sophisticated enough to leave no detectable trace. The absence of a body is also significant. The search conducted in the days and weeks after the hijacking was thorough by the standards available to law enforcement in 1971. It did not find him. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but 9 years of nothing. No bones, no gear, no confirmed sighting, is at minimum consistent with a man who walked away. And there is the manner of the man himself. Every account from the crew of Flight 305 describes someone operating at a level of composure that is genuinely unusual under those circumstances. Florence Schaffner, Tina Mucklow, Captain Scott, none of them describe a man who seemed frightened or excited or unraveling under pressure. They describe someone who behaved as though the outcome were already decided. That quality, that particular brand of operational calm, does not come from nowhere. It is trained or it is temperamental, and either way it suggests a person capable of the long discipline that surviving and disappearing would require. The weakness of this theory is the jump itself. The conditions were brutal, the parachute was non-steerable, the terrain was unforgiving, and the clothing was entirely wrong. Survival under those specific circumstances, even for a trained military parachutist, required a degree of fortune that cannot simply be assumed. Several FBI aeronautical consultants over the years have modeled the jump and concluded that the probability of a successful landing in those conditions with that equipment was meaningful but far from guaranteed. Theory 1 requires Cooper to have been not just skilled but lucky, and to have remained lucky through a night in near freezing rain in dense forest with a heavy bag of money strapped to his body. The second theory is darker and, to some investigators, more probable. D.B. Cooper did not survive. He died either on impact, his non-steerable parachute driving him into the tree line at a speed and angle that left no survivors, or he landed alive but incapacitated, and the exposure finished what the jump began. The forest consumed him. The body decomposed over years, scattered by weather and animals across a landscape so vast and so dense that a ground search covering hundreds of square miles still could not locate it. The money reached the Columbia River via a tributary system, washed from wherever it was dropped or lost, carried downstream through years of seasonal flooding, arriving at Tenor Bar not by human agency, but by gravity and water. The evidence for this theory is the jump conditions themselves, which we have already examined and which were genuinely extreme. It is also, paradoxically, the absence of the money. If Cooper survived and cashed the cash, some trace of it should have surfaced eventually, not because he would necessarily spend it, but because hiding $200,000 in a physical location for decades is genuinely difficult. Cash deteriorates. Hiding places are discovered. People talk on their deathbeds. The complete silence around those bills for 9 years, and the partial reappearance of a small fraction of them in a location that doesn't fit a survival scenario, is at least as consistent with a dead man whose money slowly dispersed through the watershed as with a living one who buried it carefully. The weakness here is equally significant. No body was ever found. Not a fragment. Not a piece of equipment. Not a scrap of the suit or the briefcase or the parachute harness. Forests do consume the dead, but they rarely do so this completely, this cleanly, with this total and absence of any remaining physical trace across 50+ years of subsequent hiking, logging, and forest management activity in the region. And then there is the third theory, the one the FBI has never fully committed to publicly, but has never fully set aside either. D.B. Cooper had inside help. This theory does not require conspiracy in the dramatic sense. It does not require a shadowy organization or a government cover-up. It requires only what the evidence already suggests, that Cooper was not a lone amateur who got lucky, but a man with professional connections to the aviation industry who may have had access to information, logistics, or support that made his escape more viable than it appeared from the outside. The titanium particles in his tie point toward the aerospace manufacturing world. His knowledge of the 727's aft staircase, a feature not widely publicized and not intuitive to a layperson, suggests either deep research or insider familiarity. His specific demands about altitude, airspeed, and flap configuration are the demands of someone who understood not just how to hijack a plane, but how to survive exiting one. The inside help theory gains additional weight when you examine certain anomalies in the FBI's own handling of the investigation. The parachute question, whether a dummy rig was among the 4 delivered, was never officially resolved, and the relevant records were not made fully public. The titanium particle analysis from the tie was conducted years after the tie was collected, and the full results were never released. And in 2016, when the FBI formally closed the active investigation, the stated reason was a reallocation of resources toward more pressing violent crime cases, a rationale that struck many NORJAC veterans within the Bureau as inadequate for a case that had never been solved and that still had unexamined physical evidence in the files. Which brings us to the suspects. Over 50 years, the FBI formally investigated more than 1,000 individuals in connection with NORJAC. 3 names have risen above the rest, each for different reasons, each with different evidence, each with a story that is compelling and incomplete in equal measure. Robert Rackstraw is perhaps the most cinematic candidate. A former Army paratrooper and Special Forces trainee, Rackstraw had a criminal record that read like a checklist of dangerous competencies: fraud, theft, weapons charges, check kiting across multiple states, a prison escape, a faked drowning. He was interviewed by the FBI in the late 1970s and was a serious suspect for years. He had the parachute skills, he had the criminal audacity, he had the demographics. He denied any involvement for the rest of his life and died in 2019 without confessing. In his later years, a team of private researchers claimed to have found coded messages in the original ransom note pointing to Rackstraw as the author, a claim the FBI reviewed and declined to act upon. The evidence against him was always circumstantial, and his alibis, while imperfect, were never conclusively broken. Kenneth Christiansen is a quieter and in some ways more unsettling candidate. A former Northwest Orient airline employee, meaning he worked for the very airline whose plane was hijacked. Christiansen had served as a paratrooper in World War II and had worked in the aviation industry for decades. He matched the physical description given by the crew. He lived modestly on a flight attendant and purser's salary, but purchased a house in cash shortly after the hijacking, a transaction that was never satisfactorily explained. He died in 1994, and it was his brother Lyle who came forward years later with the suspicion saying that on his deathbed, Kenneth had said there was something Lyle needed to know, but had died before he could say it. The FBI investigated Christiansen as a suspect and cleared him, but the cash house purchase remains unexplained in the public record. L.D. Cooper is the most recent significant candidate to emerge. His niece, Marla Cooper, came forward in 2011, claiming that her uncle, Lynn Doyle Cooper, known to the family as L.D., had confessed to the hijacking to her father shortly after it happened. She provided a guitar strap she believed L.D. had used during the hijacking and items of clothing for DNA comparison. The FBI tested them. The results were inconclusive. L.D. Cooper had died in 1999. The DNA extracted from the tie and the ransom materials was too degraded to produce a definitive match or exclusion. The case against him rests almost entirely on a family memory of a confession, compelling in its specificity, impossible to verify. Here is the narrator's honest assessment, having sat with this evidence across all of its contradictions. Theory 2, that Cooper died in the jump, cannot be dismissed. The conditions were extreme and the absence of a body, while not proof of death, is consistent with it. But it leaves too many things unexplained. The parachute choice, the titanium particles, the operational precision that speaks not of luck but of knowledge. Dead men do not usually leave behind the residue of a professional identity this coherent. Theory 1, that he survived and disappeared, remains the most emotionally and evidentially satisfying. It accounts for the absence of the money, the absence of the body, and the quality of the man, as described by those who sat across from him for 4 hours. It requires him to have been skilled and fortunate, and the evidence suggests he was at minimum the former. But Theory 3 is the one that lingers, because here is the detail that the FBI has never publicly explained, and that sits at the center of the case like a splinter you cannot locate, but can always feel. One of the suspects investigated in the early years of Norjack, whose name has not been officially released in the unredacted case files, submitted to a polygraph examination administered by FBI agents. He passed it. His alibi held under initial scrutiny. And then, quietly, without public announcement or explanation, the FBI dropped him from the active suspect list. Not because the evidence cleared him, not because new evidence pointed elsewhere. The internal case notes, as partially released under Freedom of Information requests over the years, do not explain the reasoning. The agents who worked that interview have not spoken publicly about it. The suspect's identity, if it was ever confirmed, has not been released. A man passed a polygraph in connection with the most famous unsolved air piracy in American history, and the FBI never explained why they walked away from him. We will come back to what that means, but first, we need to talk about what this case left behind. There is a particular kind of story that a culture cannot let go of, not because it is the most dramatic, or the most violent, or the most consequential. History is full of events that dwarf the D.B. Cooper hijacking in all of those categories. But because it touches something underneath the drama, something about the way power works and who gets to disappear, and what we secretly admire even when we know we shouldn't. D.B. Cooper did not kill anyone. He did not destroy anything. He walked onto a plane, made his demands with quiet authority, collected what he asked for, and vanished into a country that was, in November of 1971, already deeply tired of being told what to believe by the people in charge. The Vietnam War was grinding into its second decade. The Pentagon Papers had been published that summer, confirming what many Americans had already suspected, that their government had been lying to them systematically and deliberately about a war that had consumed 50,000 American lives. Watergate was 14 months away. The institutions that were supposed to hold the country together were visibly corroding, and the people asked to trust them were running out of reasons to do so. Into that specific cultural moment stepped a man who beat the system so cleanly that the system spent the next 50 years unable to admit it had lost. The FBI's formal closure of the Norjack investigation came on July the 12th, 2016. The Bureau issued a brief statement explaining that it was redirecting resources previously devoted to the case toward higher priority violent crime investigations. After 45 years, more than 1,000 investigated suspects, multiple ground searches, forensic analyses conducted across 4 decades, and the collection of thousands of pages of tips, interviews, and evidence, the case was being set aside, not solved, not closed on the basis of a conclusion, simply deprioritized in language so careful and so bureaucratic that it communicated, between every measured line, the thing the FBI could not quite bring itself to say directly. They never found him. The Norjack file, even in its suspended state, remains the only unsolved case of air piracy in the entire history of American commercial aviation. Every other hijacking in the modern era of American flight has been resolved, perpetrators identified, prosecuted, killed, or confirmed dead. Cooper alone remains a question mark in the federal record, a placeholder where a name should be, a case number attached to a face that exists only as a sketch. But long before the FBI formally stepped back, the world had already decided what to do with D.B. Cooper. It had made him a folk hero. The mythology assembled itself with remarkable speed. Within months of the hijacking, Cooper had appeared on T-shirts and bumper stickers across the Pacific Northwest, bars in the Columbia River region named drinks after him, a 1981 film, with Treat Williams playing a fictionalized version of the hijacker, presented him as a charming rogue, all charisma and principle, a man who stole from a corporation rather than a person, and had the good grace to do it without hurting anyone. Books followed, documentaries, a cottage industry of amateur investigators, online forums, annual conventions in the small Washington town of Ariel, not far from the jump zone, where Cooper enthusiasts gather every year around Thanksgiving to drink, debate, and toast a man none of them have ever met, and most of them half believe is dead. The town of Ariel, Washington holds a D.B. Cooper celebration every year. People come dressed as the man in the dark suit. They argue about Rackstraw and Christiansen and L.D. Cooper. They buy Cooper merchandise and pose for photographs beside a life-size cutout of the FBI composite sketch. It is part carnival, part genuine investigation, part communal act of myth-making, a town that has decided to own its proximity to a legend rather than be embarrassed by it. What explains this? Why does a hijacker, a criminal by any legal definition, become the subject of affectionate annual celebration in the American interior? Part of it is the era. The early 1970s produced a specific strain of American anti-hero worship. The Sundance Kid, Bonnie and Clyde, the bank robbers and draft dodgers and whistleblowers who said no to something large and institutional and got away with it, at least for a while. Cooper fit that template so perfectly that he might have been designed for it. He did not grandstand. He did not issue a manifesto. He did not claim to be fighting for anyone or anything. He simply identified a gap in the system, exploited it with precision and calm, and disappeared. In a moment when Americans were being asked to trust institutions that had repeatedly demonstrated they did not deserve that trust, a man who beat those institutions cleanly and quietly carried a particular romance. Part of it is also the human fascination with the clean getaway, the fantasy, which almost never survives contact with reality, of simply stepping out of your life and becoming someone else. Cooper did not just rob a plane. He committed, in the American cultural imagination, the perfect crime. Not perfect in the sense of flawlessly executed. The parachute choice, the jump conditions, the money's strange reappearance all complicate that. But perfect in the sense of unresolved. He was never caught. He was never charged. He was never humiliated in a courtroom or photographed in handcuffs or reduced to a mugshot. He remained, permanently, the man in the composite sketch. Sunglasses, dark suit, unknowable, which meant that the imagination could project onto him anything it wanted. The practical legacy of the hijacking is less romantic but more lasting. Within months of the Cooper case, the FAA began implementing the screening procedures that would eventually become the standard architecture of American airport security. Metal detectors, mandatory identification, bag screening, the casual, open-access boarding process that had allowed a man to walk onto a commercial aircraft with a briefcase bomb and a plan in November 1971 was systematically dismantled over the following years, in direct and explicit response to what Cooper had demonstrated was possible. More specifically, the Boeing 727, The aircraft Cooper had selected with what now looks like deliberate precision was modified. Engineers designed and manufactured a mechanical device that attached to the aft air stair mechanism and prevented it from being lowered during flight. The device was informally named the Cooper Vane. It was mandated across the entire 727 fleet, and it was retrofitted to every existing aircraft in service. The Cooper Vane meant that no one could ever again exit a commercial aircraft the way D.B. Cooper had exited Flight 305. The door he had used was permanently mechanically closed. He had, in disappearing, rewritten the physical design of commercial aviation. The ransom bills tell their own coda. After Brian Ingram's discovery at Tina Bar in 1980, the FBI retained most of the recovered currency as evidence. A portion was eventually returned to Ingram as the finder, and those bills have been sold and resold at auction over the decades as collector's items, each one carrying the weight of the mystery they represent. The remaining $194,200, the vast majority of the ransom, has never surfaced. Not a serial number, not a sighting, not a deathbed disclosure of a buried cache somewhere in the forests of southwestern Washington. The money is either gone with the man who carried it, or it is still out there somewhere, deteriorating slowly in whatever darkness it was placed in 50 years ago. And here, at the end of what we know, we return to the thread that was planted at the very beginning of this story. The $5,800 found at Tina Bar in 1980 was not where it should have been if Cooper had jumped over the Cascade foothills, died or survived, and the money had entered the Columbia River system through natural water movement. The hydrological analysis is not ambiguous on this point. The Columbia at Tina Bar does not receive drainage from the jump zone in a pattern that would carry bundled currency to that specific location and deposit it in the precise sediment layer where Brian Ingram found it. The bills were buried in a way that is inconsistent with years of river transport. They arrived at Tina Bar, the evidence suggests, from somewhere closer, and by some means that has never been established. The question of who put them there and why only $5,800 of $200,000 was ever found, and why that fraction was found in a location that fits no credible reconstruction of the jump trajectory. That question has been asked by FBI agents, independent researchers, hydrologists, forensic accountants, and amateur investigators for more than 4 decades. It has not been answered. This is where the official record goes silent. Not with a resolution, not with a confirmed identity, not with a body or a confession or a case closed on the merits. Just a file suspended indefinitely, a composite sketch that has hung on FBI walls longer than most agents have been alive, and a set of facts that point in several directions at once, without converging on anything that can be called the truth. D.B. Cooper stepped off the back of a Boeing 727 on the night before Thanksgiving, 1971, and the darkness took him. What the darkness did with him afterward, whether it killed him, hid him, or simply watched him walk away, is a question that has outlasted the agents who worked the case, the plane he hijacked, the airline he robbed, and most of the people who are alive to see it happen. It may outlast all of us. Not the jump, not the money, not the titanium particles or the river currents or the polygraph that was passed and then quietly forgotten. What I keep coming back to is the tie. He left it on purpose, or he forgot it, which, given everything we know about how this man operated across 4 hours of one of the most methodical criminal acts in American aviation history, seems deeply unlikely. A man who specified flap angles and airspeed and parachute delivery logistics did not forget his tie. He left it. Whether he left it as a message, a calling card, or simply because a clip-on tie is the one thing you remove when you're about to jump out of a plane into a freezing rainstorm at 10,000 feet, we cannot say with certainty. But it is the only physical piece of him that remained on that plane. A black tie on a seat in row 18, carrying in its fibers the invisible residue of a life we have spent 50 years trying to reconstruct. It is the most eloquent piece of non-evidence in the history of American law enforcement, an object that tells us almost everything about who this man might have been, and nothing at all about where he went. The evidence points 2 directions at once, and it has always pointed 2 directions at once. Toward a man skilled enough to survive, and toward conditions hostile enough to kill him. Toward a body that was never found, and toward a wilderness vast enough to swallow one completely and leave no trace across 5 decades of subsequent human activity in the region. toward $200,000 that never surfaced in circulation, and toward $5,800 that surfaced in the wrong place, buried in a sand layer on a riverbank that the hydrology says it should not have reached. The case does not resolve. It does not narrow toward a single point and deliver a clean verdict. It fans out, the further you follow it, into more questions than it started with. Every answer the investigation produced came attached to a new contradiction. Every piece of physical evidence pointed somewhere that the other evidence said was impossible. And maybe, and I have spent a long time sitting with this thought, maybe that is exactly how he planned it. Not the contradiction itself necessarily, not the river anomaly or the parachute question or the titanium particles in the tie, but the disappearance as a total act, the completeness of it, the way he left just enough, a note, a tie, a handful of bills in a riverbank, a composite sketch that could be almost anyone, to keep the story alive without ever giving it a resolution. A man who understood, perhaps better than anyone who has tried to find him since, that the most powerful thing you can leave behind is not evidence. It is a question, or maybe he is simply gone. Genuinely, completely, finally gone. And the mythology we have been constructing around his absence for half a century says more about us than it does about him. About our need for the clean getaway to be real, for the system to have been beaten by someone who deserved to beat it. About what it means, in a country that was built on the promise of reinvention, to imagine that a man could step off the back of a moving plane and become someone entirely new on the other side of the dark. We needed that story in 1971, when the institutions were crumbling and the official narratives had stopped being believable. We still need some version of it now, which is perhaps why this case refuses to fade the way most 50-year-old crimes do. We want him to have survived. We want him to have walked out of those woods cold and bruised and alive, to have found a road eventually, to have driven somewhere far from Washington State and built a quiet life in a place where nobody asked too many questions. We want him to have been careful with the money, not because we endorse the theft, but because carelessness would have diminished him, would have reduced the whole extraordinary act to something small and squandered. We want him to have grown old somewhere warm, to have watched the news reports about his own disappearance with a private satisfaction that nobody around him would ever understand, to have ordered bourbon occasionally, in memory of a Tuesday night in 1971 when everything went exactly as planned. Whether any of that is true, we do not know. We may never know, and I think that is something worth saying plainly, without dressing it up in false profundity. This case may simply never be solved. The people who knew the answer are likely dead. The physical evidence that remains has been examined to the limit of current forensic technology. The FBI has moved on. The forest has had 50 years to finish whatever it started on the night of November the 24th, 1971. What we are left with is the story itself, and the story, it turns out, is enough. It is enough to have sat with this mystery seriously, to have followed the evidence where it actually goes, rather than where we wished it would, to have resisted the temptation to wrap it in a bow it does not deserve. The D.B. Cooper case is not a puzzle with a hidden solution waiting to be unlocked by the right amateur investigator with the right database access. It is something rarer and more honest than that. It is a genuine unknown, a place where the record ends and the imagination begins, and where the line between those two things has never been clearly drawn. That, to me, is worth more than a tidy answer. Hey everyone, thank you. Genuinely. If you made it to the end of this one, you sat with something difficult and unresolved for the better part of half an hour, and that takes a particular kind of patience and curiosity that I do not take for granted. This channel exists because people like you want history told the way it actually is, complicated, incomplete, and honest about what it does not know. If that is why you are here, the subscribe button is right there, and every single subscription tells the algorithm that this kind of storytelling deserves a wider audience. It costs nothing, and it means everything for a channel like this one. Drop your theory in the comments. I mean it. Who do you think D.B. Cooper was? Did he survive the jump and disappear into an ordinary American life? Did the forest take him on that first night and keep him? Was there someone on the ground? A car on a back road? A plan that extended beyond the aircraft. Was it Rackstraw, Christiansen, someone whose name has never appeared in any public record? We read every comment on these videos, every single one, and the theories this audience generates are consistently sharper and more interesting than anything in the official case file. So tell us what you think. The comment section on this one is going to be extraordinary, and I want to be part of that conversation with you. And one more thing before you go. Next time, we go somewhere even stranger than a rainstorm over the Cascades. A man walked into a crowded international airport, boarded a commercial flight with a valid ticket, and landed in a country that officially did not exist. The airline had no record of his ticket. The country had no record of his entry. His passport, when investigators finally traced it, belonged to a man who had died 6 years earlier in a city on the other side of the world. And when they tried to follow the trail backward through every system that should have caught him, every checkpoint, every database, every verification protocol, they found a gap so clean and so deliberate that it looked less like an escape and more like an erasure. That story is coming, and I promise you, with everything this channel has built together, it is even stranger than this one. Until then, stay curious. The history they didn't teach you is always more interesting than the history they did.